The man's fist came down on the land office counter so hard that the inkwell jumped and splattered a constellation of black dots across the yellowed maps pinned to the wall behind the clerk's head. Florence Carter did not flinch. She stood perfectly still in the morning light that poured through the grimy window of the Redemption Falls land office, her hand flat on the wooden surface, her brown eyes level, and absolutely unafraid, watching the man named Driscoll Wade rage at her from 2 feet away. "You walk away from that parcel, Florence Carter," he said, his voice dropping to something low and vicious that was worse than shouting. "You walk away right now, and maybe nothing bad has to happen to you today." Florence looked at the clerk, a nervous man named Percy Hobbs who was pressing himself against the far wall as if he hoped the wallpaper might absorb him. She looked back at Driscoll Wade. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been handsome once before too much whiskey and too many cruelties had thickened it. He owned half of the Redemption Valley already. The other half, the rich, water-fed half that stretched along Copper Creek, was what Florence had come to claim this morning under the Homestead Act of 1862. "Mr. Wade," she said, her voice so calm it made him blink, "I'm going to fill out my homestead application. I'm going to pay the $14 filing fee, and then I'm going to go out to that land and I'm going to stake it. If you have a legal objection to that process, I suggest you hire yourself a lawyer, because that is the only kind of man who can stop me." She had not known then, in that first brilliant moment of defiance, what Driscoll Wade had already set in motion. She had not known about the 3 men waiting for her on 3 separate points of the road between Redemption Falls and Copper Creek. She had not known about Simon Lawson, or about the dark convergence of secrets and history and longing that this one ordinary Tuesday morning in September of 1878 would set into motion. She had known only that her father was 3 months dead, that the letter in her coat pocket was his last gift to her, and that the land along Copper Creek was the only future she had left. That letter, that was where it had all truly begun. Her father, James Carter, had died in June of 1878, leaving Florence, 26 years old, with a wagon, 2 horses, a small amount of money, and a folded piece of paper that changed everything. James Carter had been a surveyor for the government for 20 years, and in the course of his work he had discovered something remarkable about the parcel of land north of Redemption Falls along the eastern bank of Copper Creek. The soil there was not merely good, it was extraordinary. Alluvial deposits from a prehistoric course of the creek had left behind a layer of loam 6 feet deep in places, rich with the kind of mineral content that could grow wheat taller than a man's shoulder without any amendments. James had meant to file on it himself. He had told Florence about it in the last weeks of his life, pressing her hand and making her promise, and she had promised, not knowing then how hard the promise would be to keep. Driscoll Wade had known about that land too. He had been scheming to get it filed under a false name, through a proxy, for the better part of a year. The Homestead Act required the person filing to be the actual person who would improve and work the land, but enforcement was patchy and Wade had money to grease the right palms. What he had not counted on was Florence Carter showing up in Redemption Falls on a Monday evening in September, fresh off the southern road with dust on her coat and fire in her eyes, going straight to the boarding house kept by Mrs. Ida Fenwick, and announcing over supper that she meant to file a homestead claim in the morning. Word traveled fast in a town of 400 souls. By 9 o'clock that Monday evening, Driscoll Wade knew Florence Carter was in town. By 10, he had sent a rider to fetch his foreman, a man named Cutter Briggs. By 11, he had identified 3 men willing to ride out to strategic points on the Copper Creek Road before dawn and make sure Florence Carter found the road so frightening that she turned around and went back where she came from. He had not, at any point in his planning, considered the possibility that she would discourage all 3 of them and still make it to the land office before 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Florence left the boarding house at 6:30 in the morning. The September air was cool and sharp, carrying the smell of sage and distant rain, and the sky above the eastern ridge was just beginning to blush with the first light of dawn. She had her father's surveying notes tucked into the breast pocket of her coat, her homestead application already filled out and ready in the leather satchel over her shoulder, and in her coat's right pocket, her hand rested easily on the grip of a small but very reliable Colt single-action Army revolver that had belonged to her father, and that she had been shooting since she was 14 years old. She also had, strapped to the outside of her satchel, a large and extremely sturdy wrench left over from her father's surveying equipment. It was not a weapon, technically. But Florence Carter was a practical woman, and she had learned early in life that a large wrench in the hand of a determined woman carried a certain persuasive authority. She had gone perhaps a mile and a half out of town, the road curving north between two stands of cottonwood, when she heard the horse step out from the trees to her left. The man who emerged was called Ike Dolan, though Florence did not know his name at the time. He was lean and weathered, with a cowhide vest and a rifle held loosely across his saddle. He brought his horse broadside across the road and looked down at her with an expression that was meant to be threatening, and was, in fact, fairly threatening to most people. "Morning," he said. "Road's closed." Florence looked at the road. She looked at him. She looked at the road again. "I don't see any official signage to that effect," she said. He blinked. "Beg pardon. A closed road requires notice," she said pleasantly. "County ordinance. You'd need a sign or a sheriff's deputy or both. I don't see either. So the road isn't actually closed, is it?" He opened his mouth. Something about the way she said it, so calm and so reasonable, threw him. He had expected tears or screaming, or at minimum, a woman clutching her skirts and backing away. He had not expected a quiet, composed woman in a brown coat explaining county ordinance to him at 6:40 in the morning. "Lady," he said, recovering himself, "I'm telling you to turn around." "And I'm telling you," Florence said, her right hand not moving from her coat pocket, "that I know you're working for Driscoll Wade, I know what parcel he wants, and I know that obstructing a person's legal right to access public land is a federal offense. I'm happy to keep walking while you decide what you want to do, but I will tell you honestly, sir, that I am a very good shot, and my father taught me that the first rule of survival is to never let a man on horseback get behind you." She said the last part as she was already walking, stepping around the front of his horse with an unhurried stride, keeping the horse between herself and the tree line and her eyes on Ike Dolan's face the whole time. The horse shifted nervously. Dolan turned in the saddle, tracking her, and what he saw was a woman who had not hesitated for a single second and whose hand was still in that right coat pocket. He let her go. He sat there in the road and watched her walk away, and something about the set of her shoulders told him that following her would be a very poor idea. Florence did not let out her breath until she was well around the next curve, and the sound of his horse had not followed her. Then she breathed, steady and slow, and kept walking. One down. She did not know there were two more, but she would have kept walking regardless. The second man was waiting near the place where the Copper Creek Road crossed a dry wash, about 3 miles north of town. His name was Pete Garner, and he was the kind of man who believed that the physical fact of his size was enough to stop most conversations before they started. He was standing in the middle of the road rather than on horseback, which told Florence he had planned to use his body as the obstacle, which in turn told her he had probably done this sort of thing before. It was not yet 8 o'clock in the morning. Florence slowed her pace but did not stop until she was 10 feet from him. Up close, he was extremely large. She noted this the way she noted weather conditions or road quality, as a fact relevant to navigation rather than a reason to change her destination. "You Florence Carter?" he asked. "I am." "Then you need to go back to town." "No," she said, "I don't. Mr. Wade says the road past here is dangerous." Florence shifted her satchel on her shoulder, tilting her head slightly. "Is it?" "Could be," he said, with a smile that was meant to be meaningful. "Then he should report that to the county road committee," Florence said. She reached into her satchel, not the pocket with the revolver but the outer satchel, and produced a small notebook. Could you spell your name for me, please? For the federal complaint I'm going to file regarding interference with homesteading rights under the Act of 1862. Pete Garner stared at the notebook. I'm going to need your full name and your employer's name, Florence continued, pen poised, absolutely steady. The Federal Land Office in Denver takes these complaints very seriously. They've had 3 prosecutions this year alone for exactly this kind of obstruction. She had no idea how many prosecutions the Denver Federal Land Office had conducted. But the confidence with which she said it was complete and flawless, and Pete Garner, who had the native intelligence to recognize a trap when he heard one closing around him, stepped to the side of the road. "Just passing through," he said, suddenly finding something very interesting to look at somewhere over her left shoulder. "Good morning," Florence said, and walked past him. She heard him mutter something behind her that was not complimentary, but she heard no footsteps following, and that was what mattered. It was at approximately 8:30 in the morning, half a mile before the turn that would take her to the Copper Creek parcel's eastern boundary marker, that Florence encountered the third man, and the third man was the one who gave her genuine trouble. His name was Caleb Moss, and unlike the first 2, he was not afraid of federal complaints or patient women. He was a former sheriff's deputy from Pima County who had been dismissed for cause, and he knew exactly how much the legal system could and could not do to a man who was careful about witnesses. He had 2 Confederates with him, which was not what Wade had arranged but was what Moss had decided on his own initiative, because Moss was the kind of man who believed in insurance. Florence came around the bend in the road and found 3 horses drawn across the width of it and Caleb Moss sitting his horse at the center, arms folded, watching her with eyes that had no bluster in them at all. That was what made him different. The other 2 had been performing. Moss was not performing. He was simply waiting. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice was quiet, "I'm going to save us both some time. I know about your gun. I know about your speech about county ordinance, and I know what you said to Pete Garner about federal complaints. Mr. Wade paid me to actually stop you, not to stand in the road and let you talk your way around me. So let's skip all the parts where you try to be clever, and let me tell you how today is going to go." Florence stood very still. The sun was well up now, and the light was gold across the sage flats, and it was a beautiful morning, and she was thinking very clearly about distances and angles, and the fact that 3 men on horseback represented a different kind of problem than 1 man alone. The men on either side of Moss had the look of professionals, hands loose near their rifles, not aggressive but ready. "I'm listening," she said. "You're going to turn around and go back to town," Moss said. "You're going to withdraw your application, and in exchange for that cooperation, you're going to be paid $200 in cash. That's Wade's offer. $200 is a great deal of money for a woman alone." $200 was a great deal of money for anyone in September of 1878. Florence was aware of this. She was also aware that the land along Copper Creek, if she worked it, would be worth 1,000 times that within a decade. Her father had told her. She had the survey notes, she knew. "And if I don't accept?" she asked. Moss shrugged, and there was something in the shrug that she did not like at all. It was the shrug of a man who had made arrangements. It was at precisely this moment that she heard the horse coming up fast behind her, and she turned, her hand going to her right pocket, every muscle braced, ready for the worst. The man who rode up was not one of Moss's Confederates. He was on a tall gray horse, riding hard but bringing the animal to a controlled stop a few feet from Florence, putting himself and the horse between her and the 3 men in the road ahead. He swung down before the horse had fully stopped, which was either reckless or impressive, and Florence decided it was both. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean and sun-darkened, wearing a plain work coat and a hat with a creased crown. He had a sheriff's deputy badge pinned to his coat that caught the morning light, and he was looking at Caleb Moss with an expression that was not angry, not alarmed, but deeply, specifically unimpressed. "Morning, Caleb," said Simon Lawson. He had known this morning would come. He had known since last Thursday, when he'd ridden out to the Wade ranch on unrelated business and seen Cutter Briggs in close conference with Driscoll Wade over what looked very much like a map of the Copper Creek Road. He had known when he checked the land office records and found that no claim had been filed on that parcel yet, though Wade had been maneuvering toward it for months. And when Ida Fenwick's boy had come running to his house at 6 in the morning to tell him that the woman staying at his mother's boarding house had just walked out alone on the North Road, Simon Lawson had saddled his gray horse in 4 minutes flat. He had not expected her to be as far along the road as she was. He had not expected that she would have already cleared 2 of Wade's men on her own. And he had absolutely not expected the moment when she turned at the sound of his horse, and he looked into her face for the first time, and felt something shift inside him like a foundation settling after a storm. Her face was composed and clear, with high cheekbones touched by the September sun, and dark hair pinned up under a practical hat, and eyes that were the warm brown of creek water over sandstone. She was not beautiful in the way that paintings were beautiful. She was beautiful the way a well-made tool was beautiful, the way a clean line of stitching was beautiful, because every part of her was doing exactly what it was meant to do and doing it with complete intention. "This is a private conversation," Moss said to Simon, "between me and the lady." "The lady," Simon said, "is a citizen attempting to exercise her legal rights under federal law. The 3 of you blocking this road are in violation of Section 42 of the territorial statutes regarding obstruction, and if one of you so much as clears leather, I'll add assault charges to that." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded paper. "I've also got a warrant here for your arrest, Caleb, outstanding from Judge Hennessy's court, unrelated to this morning's business. You want to handle that now, or would you rather compound your current situation by adding obstruction to what's already on your plate?" The warrant was real. Simon had found it in the office records 3 days ago. A civil warrant for a debt judgment, the kind of thing that was easy to overlook in a big stack of papers, but that Simon had been careful not to overlook. Caleb Moss looked at the warrant. He looked at Simon's badge. He looked at Florence Carter, who had not moved a single muscle and whose right hand was still in her coat pocket. He looked at his 2 Confederates, who were suddenly finding the horizon very interesting and communicating through their posture that they were not paid enough to get into a legal altercation with a deputy sheriff over a piece of farm ground. "This isn't finished," Moss said. "No," Simon agreed, "it's not. You'll want to come into town this afternoon and sort out that warrant. But Miss Carter is going to continue on her way, and you are going to let her." Moss held the moment as long as he could. Then he reined his horse aside, and his 2 Confederates moved with him, and the road was open. Florence let out a breath that she hoped was not audible. She looked at Simon Lawson, who had turned from watching Moss ride away to watching her, and there was something in his look that was careful and assessing, and also, underneath that, something warmer that he was being disciplined about not showing. "Florence Carter," she said, because someone had to say something and she preferred to be the one to start. "Simon Lawson," he said, "Deputy Sheriff, are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I had handled 2 of them before you arrived." "I know," he said. "Ike Dahlin rode past me going south about half an hour ago looking like he'd seen a ghost, and Pete Garner was sitting on a rock by the dry wash studying the ground like it had personally offended him." Something that might have been a smile moved across Florence's face. "I asked him to spell his name for a federal complaint." Simon looked at her steadily. "Did you actually file a federal complaint?" "No, but he didn't know that." Simon pressed his lips together in a way that meant he was not going to let himself laugh right now, but that the desire to do so was present and noted. "Miss Carter," he said, "I'd like to escort you the rest of the way to the boundary marker, if you'll allow it. And then I'd like to ride back to town with you when you're ready to file." Florence looked at him. There was a quality to his attention that she noticed, the way he had put his horse and his body between her and Moss without grandstanding, without asking her to step aside or treating her as someone who needed to be extracted from a situation she had walked into foolishly. He had arrived as backup, not as rescue. The distinction mattered to her enormously. That would be acceptable, she said. They walked, him leading his horse, the last half-mile to the Copper Creek parcel in the golden September morning, and they did not talk much, but the silence between them was not awkward. It was the companionable silence of two people who were each doing their own thinking, and found no need to fill the space with unnecessary words. When they reached the boundary marker, a weathered wooden post that her father had set years ago when he first surveyed the parcel, Florence stopped and looked out over the land. It spread before her in the soft morning light, the creek glinting among cottonwoods to the west, the long flat field of grass to the east that would be wheat in 2 years, and the gentle rise to the north where the soil was deepest and the future was richest. It was exactly as her father had described it. It was exactly as she had dreamed it in the months since his death. She was quiet for a long moment, and Simon Lawson watched her face and said nothing, and that restraint was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in months. "My father surveyed this parcel in 1869, she said finally. "He never filed on it. He always meant to come back." She paused. "He ran out of time." "I'm sorry," Simon said, and the 2 words were simple and entirely meant. Florence looked at him sidelong. "You rode out here awfully early for a man who had no particular reason to be involved in this business." Simon was quiet for a moment. He had the kind of face that was honest by default, that did not conceal easily what it was thinking, and what it was thinking right now was visible if you knew how to read it. He had ridden out here because he had seen injustice being arranged, and he could not leave injustice alone. He had ridden out here because a woman alone on the North Road was a woman who deserved someone watching her back. He had ridden out here, and this was the part he was being careful not to examine too directly, because Ida Fenwick had described Florence Carter to him over breakfast, and something about the description had lodged in him like a splinter. "It's my job to keep the road safe," he said, which was true but was not all of the truth. Florence clearly knew it was not all of the truth, but she accepted it with the same practical grace with which she had accepted everything else this morning, and she said, "Well then, Deputy Lawson, my father would have appreciated it. As do I." They turned back toward Redemption Falls together, and the morning unfolded around them, warm and wide, smelling of sage and coming autumn, and Florence told him about the survey notes and her father's discovery of the soil composition and her plans for the land. And Simon listened with the full and focused attention of a man who was genuinely interested in what was being said, which Florence had found to be rarer in men than it should have been. By the time they reached the edge of town, it was not yet 10 in the morning, and by the time they climbed the steps of the Redemption Falls land office together, it was 10:15. And Florence Carter walked to the counter where Percy Hobbs was still nursing his bruised nerves from the earlier visit, and she laid down her completed application and her $14 in exact coin, and signed her name in her clear, strong hand. And the deed was done. Driscoll Wade heard about it before noon. He was in his office at the ranch when Cutter Briggs brought him the news, and Briggs reported it the way a man reports bad weather, with the tone of someone who has no personal responsibility for the facts, but recognizes that the person receiving them is not going to be pleased. Wade listened to the whole account about Ike Dolan and Pete Garner and Caleb Moss, and about Simon Lawson riding out on that gray horse, and about Florence Carter walking into the land office at 10:15 and filing her claim. He did not say anything for a long time. "Simon Lawson," he said finally. "Yes, sir. That boy has been a problem since his father was alive." Cutter Briggs said nothing. He knew better than to offer opinions about Simon Lawson to Driscoll Wade. The history between those two families was old and complicated, and Wade had never entirely forgiven that history for coming out the way it had. "She filed legally," Wade said. "Filed and witnessed, sir. The clerk signed off." Wade leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He was a man who had gotten most of what he wanted in life by being willing to do things that other people stopped short of. But he was also a man who understood when a strategy had failed and a new approach was needed. Filing on the land had been his plan. The land was gone now. But there were other ways to make a woman's life on that parcel difficult enough that she gave it up voluntarily within the 5-year improvement period. She would need to build a structure, plow and plant a portion of the acreage, maintain continuous residence. Any of those things could be complicated. But Driscoll Wade was not thinking clearly because he was furious, and when he was furious he made decisions that he later had to revise. The decision he made in that moment was to go into Redemption Falls that afternoon and confront Simon Lawson directly. And this was a decision that would have consequences he did not anticipate. Florence had dinner that evening at Ida Fenwick's boarding house, which turned out to be Simon Lawson's childhood home. Ida Fenwick was Simon's aunt, his mother's younger sister, a small and extremely energetic woman of 50 who had opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them. She had taken Simon in at 16 when his parents died of a fever that swept through the valley in the spring of 1864, and she had raised him with great firmness and equal affection. When Simon appeared at the boarding house door at 6 in the evening, hat in hand, to ask if Miss Carter had settled in all right, Ida gave him a look that contained multitudes. "Come in and eat," she said. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal since Thursday." Simon looked past his aunt and saw Florence Carter sitting at the long dining table, across from a traveling salesman from Denver and an elderly schoolteacher who was stopping in Redemption Falls while she waited for her replacement documents after a stagecoach robbery. Florence looked up from her meal, and there was a moment of eye contact across the length of the room that lasted slightly longer than purely practical eye contact needed to last. "I don't want to impose," Simon said. "You're not imposing," Ida said with absolute certainty and stepped aside, and Simon came in. He sat across from Florence. The conversation at the dinner table was general and easy, the kind of conversation that happens in boarding house dining rooms across the West. Talk about the weather and the roads and the news from the Eastern papers. But underneath it, Florence and Simon had a conversation that was conducted in the small and precise language of attention, in the way he noticed when her water glass was empty and refilled it, in the way she turned the subject when the Denver salesman, a cheerful man who had not read the room, began asking intrusive questions about what a woman alone expected to do with 160 acres. After dinner, when the others had retired to the parlor or their rooms, Florence and Simon found themselves alone on the boarding house porch in the cooling September evening, and the conversation they had had there in the beginning, the conversation about the land and her father and her plans, continued and deepened and became something else. "Your father was James Carter," Simon said. "I knew of him. He was a good surveyor. People in this valley trusted his measurements." "He was a good man," Florence said. "A careful man. He believed in doing things right or not at all." She looked out at the dark street. "That's why the land matters so much. He put years of work into finding it, mapping it, understanding it. Walking away from it would mean all of that was for nothing." "Wade is going to make your life difficult," Simon said. It was not a warning intended to discourage her. It was a statement of fact delivered by someone who wanted her to go in clear-eyed. "I know," she said. "He already tried to make my morning difficult. He's going to try harder things than hired men on the road." Florence looked at Simon directly. In the lamplight from the window, his face was all shadow and line, and she was struck again by the quality of his attention, the way he was not telling her what to do, only telling her what was true. "Do you know him well?" she asked. "Wade," Simon was quiet for a moment. "My father's land bordered his," he said. "When my parents died, Wade moved the fence line 40 yards to the east. By the time I was old enough and had the resources to fight it, the land had been improved and it would have been a long legal battle with no guarantee of winning." He paused. "So I know him." "Yes." "I'm sorry," Florence said, and her two words carried the same weight that his had carried earlier in the day. He looked at her, she looked back. The night was very quiet around them, just the sound of the creek that ran through the edge of town and the distant bark of a dog and the lamplit windows of houses up and down the street. This was September 10th, 1878, and neither of them could have said exactly when the shift happened, the moment when two people who had met that morning became two people who were beginning, cautiously and carefully, to mean something to each other. "You'll need help," Simon said. "Not because you can't manage alone. I've seen today's evidence that you are more than capable of managing alone. But building a proper structure and breaking that much ground in one season is too much for one person." "I have some money saved," Florence said. "I can hire day labor." "I can help," Simon said, and the words were simple and direct and without the performance of gallantry, just a plain offer. "My off days are Wednesday and Sunday. I have some carpentry skills. The filing cabin doesn't need to be large, just solid enough to satisfy the residence requirement." Florence studied him. She was not a woman who accepted help without thinking clearly about what it meant and what it cost and what was being implied by the offering of it. "Why?" she asked. He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. He did not have a ready answer, and his not having a ready answer told her more about him than any prepared speech could have. "Because you're doing something honest and hard," he said finally, "and Wade is doing something dishonest and easy. And I've spent 8 years watching dishonest and easy win in this valley, and I'd like to see honest and hard get a fair chance for once." Florence was silent for a moment. Then she said, "That is a very good answer. It's an honest one." "I know," she said. "That's why it's good." They sat on the porch a while longer, talking about practical things: the cost of lumber in Redemption Falls, the availability of day labor, the timeline for getting a structure up before winter made construction impossible. It was the conversation of two people who were thinking about a shared project, and it was also, undeniably, the conversation of two people who found each other's company preferable to any alternative they could think of. Driscoll Wade rode into town at 3 the next afternoon and went to Simon Lawson's office, which was a small room attached to the side of the sheriff's building, the actual sheriff being a man named Harlan Root, who was 64 and largely ceremonial at this point. Wade came in without knocking and sat down in the chair across from Simon's desk and looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has decided to have a civilized conversation about uncivilized matters. "You cost me that land," Wade said. "You cost yourself that land," Simon said, "when you sent 3 men out on that road." "I sent those men because I had a legitimate claim being jumped by an opportunist." "You had a plan to file through a proxy," Simon said, "which is fraud. Miss Carter filed legally and in person under her own name. Those are different things." Wade looked at him for a moment. "Your father's land," he said, and the words were very deliberate. "You could have a portion of it back. 200 acres, southwestern corner, adjacent to what was originally yours. All you have to do is stop making yourself useful to Florence Carter." Simon Lawson looked at Driscoll Wade across the small desk in the small office for a long and completely composed moment. "Get out of my office," he said. "And if I hear of any interference with Miss Carter's residence or improvement of that parcel, I will personally carry the report to the Federal Land Office in Denver. Take your 200 acres and add them to your collection." Wade stood. He was not a man who showed anger in his face, which was in its way more unpleasant than if he had. He straightened his coat. He put on his hat. He said, "You have your father's stubbornness." He thought principles were worth dying for too. After he left, Simon sat for a moment in the quiet of his office with his hands flat on the desk, pressing down, and thought about his father, who had been a good and stubborn man, and about what it meant that Driscoll Wade had just implied what he had implied. He had always suspected that the fever that killed his parents in 1864 was not entirely natural, that the timing, coming just as his father had hired a lawyer about the fence line dispute, was too convenient. But suspicion and proof were different things, and he had spent 14 years without enough of the second. He filed the conversation away in the part of his mind where he kept things that were true but not yet actionable, and he went back to work. Over the following 2 weeks, Florence and Simon fell into a rhythm that was part practical partnership and part something considerably more significant. On his days off, he came out to the Copper Creek parcel, and they worked together, Florence with her father's surveying notes marking out where the cabin should go for best drainage and winter protection, Simon with his carpentry knowledge laying out the foundation and framing the walls. They hired 2 men from town, brothers named Luca and Emma Weiss, recent immigrants from Bavaria who were strong and willing, and who communicated their willingness to work primarily through the universal language of showing up on time and not stopping until the job was done. The cabin rose, post by post and board by board, through the golden weeks of September. It was a single room, 14 feet by 18, with a proper floor and a stone fireplace that took Simon a full day to build, and that drew perfectly when they lit the first test fire and watched the smoke curl cleanly up and out into the autumn sky. Florence watched him work. She tried to do this without being obvious about it, because she was a private woman who did not generally advertise her interior states, but she was finding that Simon Lawson was a difficult man not to watch. He worked the way he did everything, with a focused and unhurried competence that was not performance but habit, the habit of a man who had grown up understanding that things done right the first time did not need to be done again. When he made decisions about the construction, he explained his reasoning and asked for her input, and changed his approach when she had a better idea, which happened several times, because Florence had been thinking about this cabin's layout for 6 months. He had beautiful hands, she noticed, wide-palmed and scarred, with the kind of strength that showed in the way he handled tools rather than in any deliberate display. She noticed this the way she noticed the quality of the soil samples she was taking along the eastern boundary, as data, as fact, as something she was filing away for reasons she was not fully ready to examine. Simon was having his own version of the same experience. He found reasons to observe Florence when he could do so without being obvious about it, and what he observed was a person of extraordinary quality, not quality in the decorative sense but in the structural sense, a person who had been tested and had not buckled. She had knowledge of the land that was almost instinctive, reaching into the soil and reading it the way other people read print, and she had her father's surveying notes memorized to the point that she could recite the mineral composition of any section of the parcel from memory. She did not complain. She did not dramatize. When the weather turned cold one afternoon and rain came in sideways off the northern ridge, she simply put her head down and kept working until the work that needed to be inside was inside, and the work that needed to be done before dark was done. He did not know what to do with what he felt for her, which was more than he had felt for anyone in years, possibly ever. He was careful with it the way he was careful with things that were important. He did not rush it, did not display it, tried to give it room to become what it was going to become without forcing it. But the effort of being careful about it was beginning to take up a significant portion of his daily attention. The crisis, when it came from a direction neither of them had fully anticipated. Driscoll Wade had been quiet for 3 weeks after his conversation with Simon, and in that quiet, he had been doing something more dangerous than sending men to block roads. He had been researching. He had hired a lawyer from Santa Fe, a man named Aldous Prout who had a reputation for finding procedural vulnerabilities in homestead filings, and Prout had come to Redemption Falls and gone through every piece of documentation related to Florence Carter's claim with the specific intent of finding something that could be used to challenge it. What Prout found was that James Carter's original surveying contract with the government from 1869 contained a standard clause that prohibited surveyors or their immediate family from filing homestead claims on land that the surveyor had personally measured. The clause had been included to prevent exactly the kind of insider advantage that James Carter's knowledge of the Copper Creek parcel represented. The clause had also been quietly removed from surveying contracts in 1874, 4 years before Florence filed her claim, and James Carter's contract had expired in 1871. Whether Florence's claim was legally vulnerable under the 1869 clause was, at minimum, ambiguous. But Prout had filed a challenge with the Territorial Land Board regardless, and the challenge was enough to put Florence's claim in administrative limbo while the board decided whether to investigate. Simon brought her the news on a Wednesday morning in early October, riding out to the parcel where she was measuring the eastern field with the kind of careful precision her father had taught her. He came across the field toward her, and she saw from the way he rode, from the set of his shoulders, that he was carrying something difficult, and she waited for him with her measuring line still in her hands and her chin level. He told her everything: the lawyer from Santa Fe, the contract clause, the challenge to the board. He gave her every piece of information he had been able to gather, which was extensive because he had spent the previous evening at the telegraph office exchanging messages with a former classmate who was now a clerk in the Territorial Land Commissioner's office in Santa Fe. Florence listened. Her face was very still while he talked, the way a surface goes still before a deep current of water, and he knew, watching her, that she was angry in a way that was cold rather than hot, the more dangerous kind. The 1869 contract clause was removed in the 1874 revision, she said when he finished. Yes, Simon said, and my father's contract expired in 1871. Correct. So the clause doesn't apply. Legally, I believe that's right, Simon said, but Prout is arguing that the spirit of the original clause survives the revision, and that your father's special knowledge of the parcel constitutes an unfair advantage regardless of the letter of the law. That argument is absurd, Florence said. If knowledge of land made homestead claims invalid, half the claims in this territory would collapse. Yes, Simon said, it is absurd, and a good lawyer would likely defeat it. The question is time and cost. He paused. The board investigation will suspend the improvement clock while it's pending. You won't lose time against your 5-year requirement. But you also won't be able to sell or transfer or use the parcel as collateral while the challenge is active, and the investigation could take 6 months to a year. Florence was quiet for a long moment. She set down her measuring line and looked out across the field, where the autumn grass was going the color of old bronze in the October light, and the creek shone between the cottonwoods, and the cabin stood at the western edge of the field, solid and true, with the chimney Simon had built drawing smoke from the small fire she kept banked inside against the cold. He is trying to make it too expensive and too exhausting to fight, she said. Yes, Simon said, that's the strategy. And he assumes that a woman alone does not have the legal resources or the endurance to outlast a year-long challenge. That would be his assumption, Simon agreed. Florence turned and looked at Simon with an expression that was complex and decided all at once. He's wrong, she said, on both counts. Simon looked at her. He knew she was right. He also knew that legal challenges were genuinely expensive and genuinely exhausting, and that being right did not automatically make the fight easier. He was aware that he was standing in a field with a woman who was facing a serious problem, and that he wanted, with an urgency that he recognized as personal rather than professional, to help her solve it. I know a lawyer in Denver, he said. Clara Matheson. She's argued 3 homestead challenges before the Territorial Board in the past 2 years and won all 3. She's expensive, but she takes cases on reduced fees when the legal principle is significant. And this case has a significant legal principle. Florence looked at him. You know a lawyer named Clara Matheson. She argued a property case for my Aunt Ida 6 years ago, Simon said. Won the case and charged Ida half her usual fee because she said the precedent was worth more than the money. Florence was silent for a moment. Then she said, write to her. And he did, that same afternoon, a careful and detailed letter that laid out the facts of Florence Carter's case with the precision of someone who had been thinking about the best argument for it since the moment he first heard about the challenge. He wrote the letter at the table in Florence's new cabin, sitting across from her while she worked on her planting plans for the spring, and there was something about the domestic simplicity of the scene, the firelight, the scratch of pen on paper, the comfortable silence, that was both entirely new and somehow deeply familiar, the way certain things feel when they are exactly right. The letter went out on the stage to Denver the following morning. While they waited for Clara Matheson's response, life at the Copper Creek parcel had its own rhythms and its own small dramas. Florence began the preliminary work of breaking ground on the eastern field before the hard frost came, hiring the Weiss brothers again, and working alongside them with the kind of determined physicality that made Emil Weiss, who had grown up in Bavaria farming some very resistant soil, shake his head and say something appreciative in German that his brother declined to fully translate. She planted a kitchen garden along the south wall of the cabin, in the window of warm weather that October sometimes offered, covering the beds against frost with cloth she had bought in town. She hauled water and stacked wood, and made the cabin into a place that was beginning, slowly and genuinely, to feel like home. Simon came on his days off and worked alongside her, and they developed the easy shorthand of two people who have spent enough time working in the same space that they no longer need to negotiate about small decisions. They simply move around each other with the effortless coordination of long habit. He brought her news from town, where Driscoll Wade had apparently been telling anyone who would listen that the Carter woman's claim would be overturned within 6 months, and where the general opinion of the town was divided fairly evenly between people who believed Wade's version and people who knew Simon Lawson well enough to reserve their judgment. The response from Clara Matheson arrived in the second week of October, a brisk and intelligent letter that said she had reviewed the facts as Simon had presented them, and that she agreed the challenge was legally thin but procedurally annoying, and that she would take the case for a flat fee of $50 up front and an additional $50 upon resolution, with the second $50 to be waived if the board dismissed the challenge without a full hearing. She said she expected a full hearing to be unnecessary, but that she preferred to be prepared for one regardless. Florence read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully, put it in the breast pocket of her coat next to her father's survey notes, and said, "I like this woman already." Simon, reading over her shoulder without asking permission to do so and getting away with it entirely, said, "She won her first case before the territorial board against a lawyer who had 30 years of practice. She was 24 years old." Florence looked at him over her shoulder, which meant looking up slightly because he was taller than her, and he was very close because he had leaned in to read the letter, and the angle put them at a proximity that was not accidental, but that neither of them had quite orchestrated. His face was right there, the clean line of his jaw and the dark eyes that were looking from the letter directly into hers, and the moment stretched. "You admire her," Florence said about Clara Matheson. "Very much," Simon said. "She does exactly what she says she's going to do." "That is an admirable quality," Florence agreed and turned back to the letter, and neither of them moved away from the proximity they'd fallen into, which said something rather clear about where they both were. Florence wrote back to Clara Matheson that same evening, enclosing her $40, saving the last 10 for the following month when she would have it from the sale of some surplus survey equipment she was not going to need. November came in cold and clean, with frost every morning and the first snow on the northern ridgeline, and the Copper Creek parcel settled into its winter mode, the cabin warm from the stone fireplace, the fields resting under the cold sky, waiting for spring. Florence had met the first round of the improvement requirements comfortably. She had a structure, she had broken ground on more than a quarter of the required acreage, and she had her residence established. The administrative challenge was suspended against the clock. She was exactly where she needed to be. She had also, somewhere in the weeks since September 10th, fallen comprehensively in love with Simon Lawson, though she was not ready to call it that because she was a careful woman who gave words their proper weight. It was Ida Fenwick who called it what it was, One afternoon in early November when Florence came into town for supplies and stopped at the boarding house for coffee. Ida was the kind of woman who saw things clearly and stated them without ceremony. "Simon has been smiling at nothing for 6 weeks," Ida said, over the coffee. "The last time he smiled at nothing was never." "You're good for him." Florence looked at her coffee cup. "He's been very helpful." "He's done more than be helpful," Ida said. "He rode out in September because of that letter I sent him about you. Did he tell you that? That I wrote him a letter that morning saying there was a woman on the North Road who looked like she knew what she was doing and probably deserved someone at her back." Florence looked up. "He said a boy came and told him." "The boy brought him the letter I wrote," Ida said, with the serene satisfaction of someone who has planned something very carefully and is watching it unfold exactly as intended. "I may have also mentioned that you had good sensible eyes and the kind of face that a man could look at for a long time without getting bored." Florence stared at her. "He came back that evening looking like he'd been struck by something," Ida said, "which he had. Now drink your coffee, dear. He's coming to dinner tonight and I made the lamb roast he likes." Florence drank her coffee. She was not angry precisely. She was also not certain what she felt, other than a warmth that had very little to do with the coffee, and a growing suspicion that she had been, in the most well-intentioned possible way, maneuvered. Simon arrived for dinner at 6, and Florence was already there, and when he walked in and saw her sitting at the parlor table and then looked at his aunt and saw Ida's expression, he understood immediately what had been said and worked out the approximate shape of what had been admitted. Florence watched him understand, and watched him look at her, and watched him decide. He sat down across from her. His aunt had conveniently found something very urgent to attend to in the kitchen. "She wrote me a letter," Simon said. "I heard," Florence said. "She described you," he said, "in terms that were accurate but not complete. She didn't mention the wrench." Florence felt the smile start at the corner of her mouth and did not entirely suppress it. "The wrench has been very useful. I don't doubt it." He paused. "Florence, I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly because I think you prefer plain speech to anything else." "I do," she said. "I came out on that road in September because it was the right thing to do," he said. "Everything after that, all of it, has been because I wanted to. Because you are the most remarkable person I have met in 30 years of living, and because spending time with you is the thing I look forward to most, on every day, including days when I know I'm not going to see you. I'm not saying this to complicate things or to press you for anything. I'm saying it because it's true and because I think you should know it's true." Florence looked at him for a long moment. The fire in the grate was warm, and the smell of the lamb roast came from the kitchen, and the house was quiet around them, and she thought about her father, who had always said that the most important decisions in life were not complicated if you let yourself see them clearly. "Simon," she said, "I would like you to kiss me." And I would like Ida to stay in the kitchen for approximately 5 more minutes. Simon Lawson looked at Florence Carter across the parlor table in his aunt's boarding house on a November evening, and what happened to his face in that moment was not a smile exactly. It was something larger and quieter than a smile, something that was recognition and relief and joy all compressed into one expression. He leaned across the table and kissed her, and she kissed him back, and it was exactly as right as both of them had known it would be, if they had been honest about knowing it. Ida stayed in the kitchen for 7 minutes. She was a generous woman. The legal challenge from Aldous Prout proceeded through the winter with the grinding slowness of all territorial bureaucratic processes, generating paperwork and correspondence, and several strongly worded exchanges between Clara Matheson in Denver and the board's examining officer in Santa Fe. Clara Matheson was, as advertised, entirely formidable. Her arguments were clear and well-sourced, and her letters had the quality of immovability, the sense that she had thought of every counterargument before writing and had already dismissed them on sound grounds. By December, the board had indicated informally that the challenge was unlikely to proceed to a full hearing. By January, Pruitt had returned to Santa Fe, apparently having concluded that the case was not worth the reputational cost of losing it. By February, the board issued a formal dismissal of the challenge, finding that the 1869 contract clause did not apply to Florence Carter's filing and that her claim was valid in all respects. Florence received the official letter on a Tuesday in February, 1879, when the snow was still deep on the northern ridge, but the light had the quality of early spring, that pale, brilliant quality that comes before the warmth but after the worst darkness. Simon was with her when the letter arrived, having ridden out on his day off with a bag of nails she had asked him to bring from town, and she read it standing at the cabin door and then read it again and then looked up at him. "It's done," she said. He had been watching her face while she read, and he had seen the moment when the last of the long tension went out of her, the tension she had carried since September with such discipline that most people would not have known it was there. He crossed the small distance between them and put his arms around her, and she leaned into him for a moment, just one moment, allowing herself the relief of having someone to lean into. "It's done," he agreed, into her hair. Driscoll Wade made one final attempt at relevance in March of 1879, when he filed a civil suit claiming that Simon Lawson had used his position as deputy sheriff to improperly interfere in a private matter in September. The suit was heard by Judge Hennessy, who had known Simon Lawson since Simon was 16 years old and who had been keeping a careful eye on Driscoll Wade's methods for considerably longer. Judge Hennessy dismissed the suit in 40 minutes and issued a mild rebuke to Wade about the appropriate use of the civil court. He also, quietly, sent a letter to the Territorial Attorney General's office about the pattern of behavior he had observed from Wade over the past decade, including the fence line issue involving Simon's father's property. The Territorial Attorney General's office proved interested in the pattern of behavior. The investigation they subsequently opened was not quick, but it was thorough, and by the summer of 1879, it had produced enough documented evidence of fraudulent property transfers and suborned local officials that Driscoll Wade found himself facing serious federal charges. He sold the majority of his ranch holdings before the final reckoning came, taking something far less than they were worth because buyers who knew about the pending charges were limited in number, and he left Redemption Falls in August of 1879 and was not seen there again. The 140 acres that had originally belonged to Simon's father were identified as having been transferred fraudulently in 1864, and after an extended legal process that took until late 1880, they were restored to Simon's name. The process was managed largely through correspondence with the Territorial Attorney General's office and through the persistent advocacy of Clara Matheson, who had by that point become involved in the broader investigation and who proved just as formidable in that arena as in any other. But that was the future. In February of 1879, standing in the doorway of the Copper Creek cabin with the letter of validation in her hand and Simon's arms around her, Florence was thinking about something much closer to the present. "My father would have liked you," she said. Simon was quiet for a moment. "I would have liked to know him," he said. "From everything you've told me, he was a man worth knowing." "He was," Florence said. She stepped back from him, not far, just enough to look at his face. "He would also have told me not to waste time. He was not a patient man about things that were clear." Simon looked at her. He had a quality of stillness when he was paying close attention that she had come to associate specifically with him, a full and focused presence that made her feel like the only thing in the world worth paying attention to. "What are you saying?" he asked, though from his expression she suspected he knew. "I am saying," Florence said, "that I have spent the last 5 months working land I intend to work for the rest of my life, in the company of a man I intend to keep for the rest of my life, and that I would like to stop doing both of those things separately and start doing them together." Simon Lawson looked at Florence Carter in the February light, With the validation letter still in her hand and the fire going in the stone chimney behind her and the Copper Creek parcel stretching out behind him in the snow, and he said, "Are you asking me to marry you, Florence?" "I believe I am," she said. "Yes." He took the letter from her hand and set it carefully on the table inside the door. Then he took her hand, the one that had held the letter, and looked at it for a moment, and she could see him holding on to something, some strong thing, making space for it instead of letting it overwhelm him. "Yes," he said. "Obviously yes, with everything I have." They were married in April of 1879, when the Copper Creek field was showing the first green tips of the winter wheat Florence had managed to get in before the deep freeze, and the cottonwoods were putting out their first pale leaves. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Miles in the Redemption Falls Church, which was a small white building that smelled of wood polish and old hymn books, and attended by Ida Fenwick, who cried without any apology, and the Weiss brothers, who had been invited because they had built the cabin, and because Emil had confided to Florence in his careful English that in Bavaria the people who build your house are at your wedding, and he considered this a firm rule. Clara Matheson sent a letter from Denver that arrived the day before the ceremony, and that made Florence laugh aloud when she read it, because Matheson wrote exactly the way she argued, with precision and warmth and an occasional devastating joke. Florence wore her good blue dress and carried a small bunch of the early wildflowers that grew along the creek bank, and Simon wore his best coat with a new white shirt that Ida had made him buy specifically for the occasion. And when Reverend Miles read out the words that joined them, Florence looked at Simon's face and found that it was exactly the face she wanted to see for all the rest of her days. The spring was full of work. Florence had planned her planting with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything, rotating crops across the broken ground and leaving sections for improvement in subsequent years, working her father's survey notes against the realities of the growing season with a flexibility that would have made James Carter proud. Simon, now with his days off shifted to be more useful to the farm schedule, worked alongside her with the Weiss brothers through the heavy planting weeks, and then through the careful weeks of early growth, and then through the long, patient weeks of watching the wheat climb toward the summer sky. She had kept meticulous records from the beginning, soil samples and moisture measurements and growth rates, and what the records showed by midsummer of 1879 was exactly what her father's notes had predicted. The soil along Copper Creek was extraordinary. The winter wheat was producing yields that made the Weiss brothers, who were now thinking about their own homestead applications on adjacent parcels, talk about it to anyone in town who would listen, which was most people, because news about good wheat yields traveled fast in a farming community. The harvest that fall was the beginning of Florence's reputation in Redemption Falls. The yield per acre she brought in from the eastern field, her first full growing season, was the highest recorded in the valley that year. She sold most of it to the grain dealer in town, and used the proceeds to buy a good draft horse and the equipment for a more thorough breaking of the western portion of the parcel that winter. She also, in October of 1879, realized she was pregnant. She told Simon on a Sunday evening when the harvest was finished and they were sitting on the cabin porch that had been added in the spring, watching the last light go off the western ridge. She told him directly, as she told him everything, without preamble or drama. He was very still for a moment. Then he put his arm around her and she leaned into his shoulder, and they sat there in the October evening that smelled of dried wheat and coming cold, and he said nothing for a long time, and what he was doing with the silence she understood perfectly. He was making space for something so large that words were a temporary insufficiency. "A father," he said finally in a quiet voice. "In the spring," she said. "In the spring," he repeated. He turned and kissed her forehead. "Are you all right? Do you feel well?" "I feel exactly like myself," she said, "except I'm more tired in the mornings than usual, and I find that somewhat annoying." He laughed, a real and full laugh which she still loved to hear because he laughed at genuinely funny things rather than performing laughter for the sake of it. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "I love you too, more than I expected to love anyone, which is saying something." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not a sentimental woman by nature," she said, "and you have made me considerably more sentimental than I intended to be, and I find I don't object to it." He held her a little tighter. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is one," she said. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was spent in the warm industry of preparation. Simon expanded the cabin, adding 2 rooms off the east wall, which he and the Weiss brothers framed and closed in before the deep cold came. Florence, whose energy was remarkable even well into her pregnancy, managed the planning of the spring planting and the record-keeping, and the ongoing improvements to the property with the systematic attention she brought to all things, only occasionally stopping to note with mild irritation that her center of gravity was changing in ways that affected her ability to carry heavy loads, which she handled by delegating the heavy loads to whoever was nearest. Their son was born on March 14, 1880, in the cabin bedroom that Simon had built with his own hands, delivered by the capable Redemption Falls midwife, Mrs. Hortensia Gray, who had been delivering babies in the valley for 20 years, and who said afterward that Florence Carter was the most composed woman she had ever attended in labor, which was not entirely a compliment, but which Florence received as one. They named him James Simon Lawson, for both his grandfathers, and he arrived in the world with his eyes open and very dark, looking around at the morning light with an expression of profound assessment that Florence said was probably inherited from both sides of the family. Simon held his son for the first time and was entirely undone in the most complete and wholehearted way, in a manner that he made no attempt to conceal from Florence, who was watching from the bed with the particular gentle attention she gave to things that mattered most. "He looks like he's already forming opinions," Simon said. "He's 30 minutes old," Florence said. "He's a Lawson and a Carter," Simon said. "He was forming opinions before he arrived." The recovery from the birth and the early weeks with James Simon were the occasion for Ida Fenwick to become practically a resident of the Copper Creek parcel, arriving every day with food and assistance and opinions about the correct way to handle various infant situations, and being unfailingly right about most of them, because she was Ida and that was her particular skill. She also took fierce and personal pride in James Simon as if he were her own grandchild, which in every way that mattered he was. The spring planting of 1880 was managed with the help of a hired man named Jacob Reese, who had come to Redemption Falls the previous autumn, and who had the particular skills of someone who had grown up on a Kansas wheat farm and knew exactly what he was doing. Florence and Simon had the planting well underway by the time James Simon was 6 weeks old, and Florence was back on her feet, and walking the field boundaries with him strapped to her in the front carry sling that Ida had made from a length of calico, because Florence had no intention of sitting inside while the planting happened, and the sling meant James Simon could come along. Simon sometimes stopped work to watch her move along the field edge with their son against her chest, and the survey notes in her free hand and the measuring string over her shoulder, and what he felt when he watched her was something he did not have adequate words for, so he simply felt it, fully and without reservation. The summer of 1880 brought the resolution of the matter of Simon's father's land. The Territorial Attorney General's investigation into Driscoll Wade's activities had been proceeding for a year, and in July the final findings were published, documenting 9 separate instances of fraudulent property transfers in the Redemption Valley, including the fence line encroachment on the Lawson property in 1864 and the subsequent fraudulent improvement that had cemented it. Restitution was ordered, and in October of 1880, Simon Lawson received the title to the 140 acres that had been his father's. He rode home that evening with the title in his coat pocket, and found Florence in the kitchen making bread and James Simon on the floor nearby, 7 months old, and engaged in an extremely serious investigation of the dog they had acquired in the spring, a large and tolerant hound named Franklin, who endured James Simon's investigative process with impressive stoicism. Florence looked at Simon's face when he came in and knew immediately that something significant had happened. He handed her the title paper without saying anything, and she read it, and when she looked up her eyes were bright. "Your father's land," she said. "Adjacent to yours," he said. "The southwestern boundary of your parcel meets the northern boundary of mine. Together they're 260 acres of the best farmland in Redemption Valley." Florence looked at him. 260 acres, she said. "We'll need more help than Jacob Reese," he said. "We'll need 2 more Jacob Reeses," she said, already calculating. "And more equipment," he said. "And a bigger barn," she said. They looked at each other across the kitchen. Two people who had arrived at the same place from different angles and found, as often happens when you are paying attention, that the place was better than either of them had imagined separately. "Your father would have been furious about those 14 years, Florence said, about the land. "He would have," Simon agreed. "And then he would have gotten to work." "As should we," Florence said, and turned back to the bread. And Simon picked up James Simon from the floor, which caused James Simon to make the sound of extreme satisfaction that he made when his father picked him up. And Franklin, the hound, repositioned himself under the table with a sigh of profound contentment. And the kitchen smelled of bread and wood smoke, and the particular good smell of a house that is genuinely and fully lived in. The years that followed were the years of building in the most literal sense. The Carter-Lawson property, as it came to be known in the Redemption Falls community, expanded and improved season by season with the patient industry of 2 people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. Simon left his position as deputy sheriff in the spring of 1881, when it was no longer possible to manage the farm needs and the office duties simultaneously, and when it was clear that the farm needed him more. Sheriff Harlan Root retired in any case that summer, and his replacement was a younger man from the eastern part of the territory who came with his own deputies, and the transition was clean. Florence's wheat yields continued to be the highest in the valley, and by 1882 she was being consulted by other farmers in the region about soil management and crop rotation, which she found genuinely satisfying, not because of the recognition, but because she thought good farming practices deserved to spread. She began keeping a formal record of her methods, not quite a textbook but something approaching it, a systematic account of what she had learned from her father's survey notes and from 5 years of practical application on the Copper Creek parcel. In the summer of 1882, Clara Matheson came to Redemption Falls for the first and only time, combining a visit with some legal business she had in the territory. She was a tall woman, almost as tall as Simon, with a direct manner and a habit of looking at the world from an angle slightly off the usual that reminded Florence, to her warm surprise, of herself. They spent 3 days in excellent conversation, ranging from soil chemistry to territorial law, to the particular challenges of being a woman who knew what she was doing in a world that was not always ready to accept that fact. "You should write down everything you know about the land," Clara told Florence on the last evening of her visit. "Not just the methods, the whole story, how you got here and why the land matters and what you learned. People need to read accounts from women who actually worked the land, not just men who wrote about women working it." Florence thought about this seriously in the way she thought about everything and said she would consider it. She did more than consider it. She began writing it that autumn, in the evenings after James Simon was asleep and the farm accounts were balanced, sitting at the kitchen table with the oil lamp close and Simon reading in the chair by the fire. She wrote the way she farmed, systematically and with deep attention to accuracy. And what emerged over the course of 2 years was something that was part memoir and part practical guide, and entirely Florence, clear-eyed and direct, and occasionally very funny in the dry, understated way that was her particular gift. Their second child, a daughter they named Alice, arrived in January of 1883, with the same dark eyes as her brother and the same expression of profound assessment. And James Simon, who was 3 by then and very interested in having a sibling, received her with the serious and proprietary affection that 3-year-old boys reserve for things they have decided belong to them. Simon watched Florence with their daughter the way he watched her with everything she loved, with the particular attention of a man who is aware that he is in the presence of something remarkable and wants to be present for all of it. Florence with Alice in the morning light, Florence explaining to James Simon why his sister needed to sleep without his assistance for several more months, Florence walking the field in the spring with Alice in the calico sling, and James Simon running ahead between the rows, pointing out every interesting thing the spring had produced overnight. His father's land had been incorporated into the farm's operations by 1882, the full 260 acres planted and managed with the efficient precision that had become their signature. They hired 2 additional permanent hands that year, brothers from the Weiss family's circle of acquaintance, who proved to be exactly as reliable as Emil and Luca had predicted. The farm had become genuinely prosperous by any reasonable measure, and Florence kept the accounts and the records and the correspondence with the same methodical care she had brought to it from the beginning. In the summer of 1883, Emily Reese, Jacob's wife, asked Florence if she would speak at the Redemption Falls Agricultural Society's autumn meeting about her soil management practices. Florence said yes, and prepared a presentation that was, by the account of everyone who attended, both the most informative and the most enjoyable address the society had ever hosted. She used her father's original survey maps as visual aids, and the combination of the historical record and the practical present-day evidence made an argument for scientific attention to soil quality that the valley's farmers found impossible to dispute. The paper she had been writing since 1882 was finished in the winter of 1883 and sent to a publisher in Denver that Clara Matheson had identified as being interested in practical accounts of frontier agriculture. The publisher wrote back in February of 1884 with an offer that Florence negotiated upward because she was Florence, and the book appeared in the autumn of 1884 under the title The Copper Creek Method, Practical Soil Management for the High Plains by Florence Carter Lawson. It was reviewed in 3 agricultural journals and 2 regional newspapers, and the Review and the Denver Republican called it the most practically useful account of plains farming to appear in a decade, which was the kind of praise Florence valued because it was specific, and because it meant the thing she had intended to communicate had been communicated. Simon read the reviews over breakfast on a Tuesday morning and then looked at his wife across the table with an expression that she had come to know as his maximum expression of admiration, the one he reserved for things that genuinely amazed him. "James would have been so proud," he said. "I know," Florence said. "I know he would." She looked out the window at the Copper Creek field, which was showing the first winter wheat of the 1884 season, pale green in the October morning, growing in the extraordinary soil her father had found 25 years ago, and that she had come to claim 5 years ago on a September morning when the world was trying to turn her away. She thought about the road, and the 3 men, and Simon coming around the bend on his gray horse with the badge catching the morning light, and she thought about the filing clerk's face when she laid down her application and her $14, and about the way Simon's face had looked the first time they talked on the porch in the September evening. She thought about all of it, and she felt the full weight of it, the gratitude and the grief and the love that had accumulated in 5 years of living forward from that September morning. And she was grateful, in the precise and unornamented way of someone who does not take good things for granted, because she has known what it costs to fight for them. Their third child arrived in the spring of 1886, another son, named Thomas James Lawson, who was, in Ida Fenwick's expert opinion, the loudest and most emphatic newborn she had ever encountered, which everyone agreed was entirely in keeping with his parents. By 1887, the Carter-Lawson farm was employing 6 permanent hands and producing enough wheat to supply 2 of the 3 grain dealers in Redemption Falls, and the surrounding farms had adopted enough of Florence's soil management practices that the valley's overall yields had improved significantly. The Weiss brothers, Emil and Luca, had their own homestead claims on adjacent parcels and were doing well enough that they had brought 2 more brothers over from Bavaria, which meant that Redemption Falls's German-speaking community had grown from 2 to 6 in 5 years, and that the boarding house keeper after Ida Fenwick retired in 1886, a woman named Maria Weiss who had married the youngest brother, made an apple cake that was the subject of profound community appreciation. James Simon Lawson started school in 1887 at the Redemption Falls Schoolhouse and demonstrated in his very first week an aptitude for mathematics that made his teacher, a young man named Mr. Hollies, write to Florence asking if there was perhaps someone in the family who worked with numbers professionally. Florence wrote back that her father had been a surveyor and that she kept the farm accounts herself, and that James Simon had been reading her father's survey notes since he was old enough to understand what numbers meant, and that she would appreciate Mr. Hollies being challenging rather than accommodating, because her son needed to be stretched rather than indulged. Mr. Hollies subsequently had an excellent year teaching James Simon Lawson, whom he later described as the most interesting student he had taught in 10 years, excepting only Alice Lawson, who started school 2 years later, and who combined her mother's systematic intelligence with a social facility that her father privately attributed to Ida Fenwick's influence, given that Ida had been Alice's primary childcare provider in the first 3 years of her life, and Ida's social facility was legendary. The house that stood on the Copper Creek parcel by 1888 was not the 14 by 18 cabin that Simon and Florence and the Weiss brothers had built in September of 1878. It was a proper farmhouse of 8 rooms with a wraparound porch and a root cellar, and a summer kitchen, and a barn that held the draft horses and the dairy cow and the various chickens and one very old and still impressively tolerant hound, because Franklin had proved to be a dog of exceptional longevity and James Simon had loved him since infancy, and no other arrangements were conceivable. The stone fireplace from the original cabin was still there, at the center of what was now the main sitting room, and it still drew perfectly, and Florence sometimes looked at it and thought about the afternoon Simon had spent building it, the concentration and the care he had brought to getting the draw right, the way he had tested it twice before he was satisfied, and she thought that this was the quality that made her love him, not the dramatic things. Not the gray horse and the deputy's badge on the September morning, though she loved those too. The quality that had made her love him was the care he took with the things that mattered. The kind of care that built a fireplace that still drew perfectly 10 years later and would draw perfectly for 50 years more. On a September morning in 1888, exactly 10 years after Florence Carter had walked the North Road to Copper Creek and discouraged 3 men before noon and filed her claim at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, she stood on the wraparound porch of the farmhouse in the early light with a cup of coffee and looked out over the 260 acres that the law had given her and Simon, that hard work and careful thought had built into something her father had dreamed but had not lived to see. James Simon was at the kitchen table doing his arithmetic, which he preferred to do before breakfast because he said the morning light was better for numbers. A statement that Simon had pointed out made no logical sense, but that James Simon maintained with the serene certainty of an 8-year-old who has never been wrong about something he was sure of. Alice was asleep, because Alice at 5 years old had extremely strong opinions about not being woken before she was ready, a characteristic her father said she had entirely from her mother. Thomas James was on Simon's hip, 18 months old and regarding the morning with the interested attention of a person who finds everything equally fascinating and equally in need of touching. Simon came out onto the porch to stand beside Florence, Thomas still on his hip, and looked out at the same morning. 10 years today, Florence said. 10 years today, he agreed. Father would have been 63, she said. He would have been sitting right here arguing with me about the winter wheat varieties and telling me I should be planting rye on the north section. Was he right about the rye? Probably, Florence said. I've been thinking about it. Simon put his free arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and Thomas regarded his parents with the expression of a person who finds this sort of closeness very ordinary and very good, which it was. Do you ever think about that morning? Simon asked. September 10th. All the time, Florence said. I think about Ike Dolan and his closed road. I think about Pete Garner standing in the road like a boulder and me asking him to spell his name. I think about Caleb Moss, who was actually frightening. He was frightening, Simon agreed, but you weren't frightened. I was, Florence said. I just didn't let it change what I did next. He looked at her sideways. That's the most accurate description of courage I've ever heard. It's the only kind I know, she said. Thomas James, having considered his surroundings sufficiently, reached for his mother's coffee cup with the determined intent of someone who has decided that whatever the adults are having must be superior to his own options. Florence captured his hand gently and redirected it towards Simon's coat button, which he accepted as an adequate substitute, and began investigating with great seriousness. Inside, James Simon's voice floated out through the open window, reciting multiplication tables in the particular emphatic way he had of stating things he already knew to be true, as if arithmetic were simply a matter of sufficient confidence. Alice's voice followed, a single word of strong objection about the noise, in the tone of a girl who is still technically asleep, but has opinions anyway. Franklin the hound appeared at the corner of the porch, ancient and substantial, found the morning acceptable, and settled at Florence's feet. The wheat in the eastern field was showing its first autumn green, and the cottonwoods along the creek were beginning their turn toward gold, and the sky above the northern ridge was the particular sharp September blue that Florence had come to associate with everything that had started on a September morning 10 years ago, with the courage that looks like calm and the love that grows from honest work done alongside someone worth working beside. I'm glad you rode out that morning, Florence said. I'm glad you were already 3 men in by the time I got there, Simon said. It told me everything I needed to know. She looked up at him. What did it tell you? That you didn't need me, he said, which meant that you being glad I was there was worth considerably more. Florence Carter Lawson looked at Simon Lawson in the September morning light, 10 years of life and work and love and 2.5 children between them, and thought that her father, that careful and honest man, had been exactly right. The most important decisions were not complicated if you let yourself see them clearly. Come inside, she said. The children need breakfast and I need to argue with James Simon about the rye. You could just decide to plant it, Simon said, following her through the door. That's not the same as arguing about it, Florence said. Franklin rose from his place at her feet and followed them inside, and the door closed on the September morning, and the wheat grew green in the field that Florence Carter had claimed, and the life that had begun on a road outside Redemption Falls, New Mexico Territory, in September of 1878, continued in all its full and unhurried and extraordinary particularity, exactly as it had been built to do. With care and intention and the kind of love that does not announce itself but is simply present, in every stone of a fireplace that draws perfectly, and every row of wheat planted true, and every morning that 2 people wake and find the life they have made is still, against all odds and despite every attempt to discourage it, exactly what they intended.